In this video, I demonstrate how to neutralize colors by painting the still life. I use nothing but vivid colors. I don't have black, grays, or any neutral colors on my palette. One of the challenges is to mix the color of these grapes using phthalo green. I also mixed the color of these pears using the most vivid orange that I could find. And I mixed the color of the background using pyrrole red, which is often referred to as Ferrari red. And that's because it's so vivid, it's frequently used to paint sports cars. Being able to neutralize colors is a very important part of learning how to mix colors and how to paint. Here's my reference photograph. If you want to follow along, you can download it when you sign up for my free email newsletter. There's a link to the sign up form in the description below. Here's my drawing. I completed it with acrylic markers. These are acrylic markers so they won't bleed through the final painting. I have an entire video about this drawing process that I use. There's a related video section in the description below if you're interested in watching it. I'm using golden open acrylics. They're slow drying acrylics. If you don't want to use a professional acrylic, you can use a student acrylic such as Liquitex Basics. In fact, I have a tutorial on how to blend student acrylics like oils. In that video, I show how you can add retarder to student acrylics to make them dry slower. So this is phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, quinacridone magenta, pyrrole red, cadmium yellow primrose, benzimidazoline yellow medium. This is more transparent than the cadmium yellow primrose. You can tell by the stripes, the cadmium yellow blocks out more of the black stripe than the benzimidazoline. It's also slightly oranger than the cadmium yellow. Cadmium orange and phthalo green yellow shade. You could also use the blue shade if you wanted to. And titanium white. I always get the larger two because you end up using more white than any other color. I'll begin by mixing the background color. I'll start with the pyrrole red, but what would you add to this to make it darker and less vivid? The way that you dull a color is if you have a warm color like red, you would use a cool color to make it duller and darker. So the one thing to keep in mind though is that color wheels aren't perfect and mixing complements are different than the way color works when you mix it with light. Just to simplify it, just think about warm versus cool colors. So if you have red, you could try green or blue to make it duller and darker, and I often use blue. So here's the red, and you might be tempted to add black to it, but ultramarine blue, when you add that to it, it starts to turn it more of like a brownish color. You would think it would make purple, but it's not really how it works. I have entire videos on how to mix purple. So you add more to it, you can tell it's getting darker and less saturated. It's not quite as dark as what I need it to be, so I'll add more blue in there. And that's much closer. That's almost the color. I'll add a little bit more blue. When you add way too much blue, it does make like a dullish purple, but it's not vivid at all. So that's pretty close. I might lighten it slightly. Maybe add just a touch of red. And I'll mix up more of this, but I'm just trying to figure out what colors are in here. So it looks pretty good. So I took the time to mix up a larger quantity of this paint so I can paint in the entire background. And I also mixed up a lighter version that just has more red and a little bit of yellow in it for the left side. So now I have all the colors for the background. So next I'll mix the color of this grape. And I'll start with a very vivid green just to demonstrate how you can neutralize it. I use the cadmium yellow and the phthalo green. And as you can see, that makes a super vivid green. If I compare it to the grape, it looks completely unnatural. That's not what you would use to paint green grapes. So what would you add to this to make it less saturated? So to make this less saturated, you would add a warm color to it. I'll start with the red and we'll see what that makes. You wouldn't think grapes have red in it, but you can see that made that green much more neutral. Okay, it looks like the grapes have a little bit more yellow in there. But I can see it still has more red. It's kind of surprising how much red there is in there because you think of them as being green. Oops, that's too much. So that's pretty close. I think maybe just a touch more red. I often say in my color mixing videos, things like, there's a lot of red in these grapes and people don't understand what I'm talking about. But can you see how that red made that green look more natural? So you might think you can add black to it, which black will make it less saturated, but you'll still have to add red to it. I mean, I could try that just as a demonstration. So I'll mix up a little bit of that bright green from the cad yellow and the phthalo green. So there's that vivid green, and if I do add this carbon black to it, it makes it darker and it is less saturated, but we're still not close to the color of the grapes. I could add more to it. maybe a little more yellow because this looks too green. I'll just compare it to this color because we know that's pretty close. So you can see that this green is darker, but it doesn't have the look of the actual grape color. And I probably can get there by adding red into it. So I'll mix that in there. And that is pretty close to what we had, but if you think about it, I was able to get to the grape color just by using red. With this mixture, I had to add the black, and then I still needed red to get to the color. So using black doesn't really simplify things. So that's one of the reasons why I don't recommend using black. I made an entire video about that. That's what my last video was about. And the whole point of that is I was still able to mix the grape color using the black, but it actually required more colors. It was the yellow, green, black, and red, whereas this was just the yellow, green, and red. So there's one less color in there. Every variable you add to your color mixtures makes it more complicated. You have to get the ratios right in order to match the color. The other thing is that I often control how light or dark a color is, and I also adjust the hue at the same time by using this method rather than darkening it and then figuring out, oh, it also needs red. If that makes any sense. It seems simpler to me to do it this way. I think the next thing I'll mix are the colors for this bowl. And this could be really tricky because your mind thinks, well, the bowl is white, it must be gray, the shadow color must be gray. But the problem is this pear is reflecting color onto the bowl. And sometimes that can be hard to see. So here's one trick for being able to see colors more accurately. This is called a color isolator, and it's just a piece of white mat board that I punched a hole in. I also painted it gray just to make it slightly easier to judge the colors. And that's because the white sometimes makes things look darker than what they actually are. The left side of the bowl, you can tell it's mostly gray. It might have a little bit of like blue in there. But as I make my way over, you can see it starts to become almost the color of the pear. Like maybe it's the same color as this is here. I'll start by mixing the color of the left side of the bowl. That'll be easier. I got a little bit of that color left on my palette knife. It doesn't really matter. In fact, that might help a little bit. So mixing grays and blacks from colors is a perfect example of how to neutralize colors. In fact, my video 11 ways to mix black, it's pretty much an entire video about neutralizing colors because I show 11 different ways to mix black, and I also mix grays from those same combinations. So there's many different ways to get to this. I could use ultramarine and the quinacridone to make a purple color, and I'll use the benzimidazoline yellow to neutralize it. So to me that looks too yellow. I'll add just a touch of the ultramarine to it. And my color is too dark. I'll add more of the white in here. And I think it still needs more blue. I still see that there's too much yellow in there. I'll add just a little bit more of the quinacridone. So the idea is this is too yellow. What would make that more neutral would be a purplish color. So if I add a little bit of the quinacridone, a little bit of the blue, that should help make it look more neutral. It's not too bad right there. I think I should probably check my iPad too because this printer has a tendency to go a little too magenta. So the iPad is lighter because there's light being emitted from it, but it's not too far off. I think mine might be a little too pink, but I could easily neutralize that a little bit. I think a little yellow and some blue would help. That's not too bad for that section right there. Now I'll move on to mixing this color right here. This print isn't too bad, so I'll just continue to use that for the color matching. So obviously it's more orange. Maybe not that much orange. I'll add some ultramarine in there to make it less vivid. So you see how that works? That orange is less saturated now that I add the blue to it. I think the bowl has more red in there. It's not too bad. It has to go darker, so add more blue. I'm going to mix up more of this, so just give me a minute here to get back to where we were. All right, I got more volume. I'll just mix these two together. It needs more red, and I think it has to go darker. So I'll add more parallel red and a touch of ultramarine. I'll leave this color here just so we can see how it's changing. That's not too bad for that section. I can always add some of the other color I mixed to it for the transition here. And then I can add more of a darker color here to get this darker section. And this is how I would mix the pear color. You can see that's pretty much the pear color. I'm going to mix up more volume of this so that I have enough for the painting. But I'll do that off camera just so you don't have to watch me mix all this again. I took a little time to move the colors over to the side so I have more mixing area. I think I'll mix the purple grape color next. So for these grapes, a good mixture for purple is quinacridone magenta and ultramarine blue. That makes a purple that's pretty close to dioxazine purple. I demonstrated how to mix different purples in a couple different videos. They're in the related video section in the description below. The interesting thing about the color of these grapes is that the outside is kind of like a dark purple, and in the center where the highlight is, there's a little bit more magenta. So you can see this purple on my palette knife is too on the blue side and it's too vibrant. So maybe I'll add some more magenta. And then to make that less vibrant, I'll add some of the cadmium yellow primrose. And that definitely makes it less vibrant. So the color on the end of my palette knife, you can see that's pretty close to that grape color. And then for the center part, I just need to add a little bit more magenta and maybe some white so it's lighter. It's probably too much white. I'll add a little bit more of the magenta in here. It's not too bad, maybe a little bit more yellow. And just a touch of magenta. I think that's pretty good for the area right next to the highlight. All right, for the countertop, it's more of a neutral color. There is more magenta in there. I think some of the background is being reflected on there too. As you can see, it's a glossy material. The bowl is being reflected in it. So there's a variety of colors in here, but I'll mix like a basic color that's close to this light section. If you just mix the majority of primaries together, you do get like a muddy brown color. So that was just red, yellow, and blue, and I'll add some white to it. That's too equal. That made a perfect gray. Browns and tan colors are basically dark red or dark orange. So I'll just add more red and yellow in here. I think the print's a little bit more lighter and a little bit more magenta. So I'll add some magenta in there. That matches this darker section pretty well. If I add a little bit of white in there, it'll probably match that lighter section. So here it is with a little bit more white. I think maybe a little bit more magenta would be fine, but this is a good start. And that's pretty much how I'll mix these colors for the countertop. I think I'll get started with the painting, and I could mix some more of these colors as I go. I'm going to start by painting the background, and this is an inexpensive nylon brush. You really don't need expensive brushes for acrylic painting. Here's my background color, and I mixed up a ton of this. I'll cut around the pear. I often paint the background more than once, so I don't really get too tedious about getting it right the first time. As I move to the left, I'll add some of this color here, and that helps to have some of the lighter color mixed up first so I can do this. You see that's a little bit more red. And you can compare it to the print. I have it above my easel here so I can look at it real quick. And I want to cut around these stem shapes. I can get in there with a smaller brush later. I'll pick up some more of this lighter color as I move to the left. I think this might be about what I need for the top left corner. And then I can just turn my brush over to get some more of that burgundy color in there. In fact, I'll dip into it just so I can mix it in. It seems like the transition's about here. And once again, I'll just dip into the lighter color because I'll work my way over here. This is the transition area, so I'll just work some of that in there. I'll go a little bit heavier than what I normally do. So I'll put a lot of it on my brush and apply that to the bottom. See how I painted a straight edge with that 1-inch flat? Pretty easy. So I just need to like smooth this out a little bit. And like I said, I could just take a smaller brush and paint in some of these negative shapes. I'm just trying to build up color along the edges of the grape so that it's easier to blend. So that's not too bad. I'll take a soft brush like this. It's often used for like watercolor. And I'll just sort of like smooth out some of the bristle marks. Like I said, I'll probably work back into this later, so I'm not too concerned about how it turns out. I'll just work my way around and I sort of dab it and do circular motions. This is kind of like the area where it starts to blend. So I'll just pull some of that into the darker area. Maybe do some straighter brush strokes like this to smooth it out. I picked up a new brush just to add this darker color here. That's another tip is you can paint faster if you have multiple brushes because you can leave the paint on the bristles. You don't have to clean it every time you change colors. So I have a number of these 1-inch brushes. That way I can switch between colors pretty quickly. I think that looks better. And now I'll wipe some of the color off my blending brush and I can get back in here and continue smoothing it out a little bit. There's some glare on here because it's wet, but that won't look that way when it's dry. In fact, at my angle, I don't even see it. I'll do the grape next. So here's my grape color. It's just this color I start out with. It's not like the entire grape is going to be this color. This is one of the reasons why I use the cadmium yellow primrose, is because it covers a little bit better. And even with the cadmium yellow, I feel like I'm putting this down a little bit thicker just so I don't get streaks. Now for the darker bottom section, I can mix that color up. I think I could even just use some of this purple to make it darker. Now that looks a little too reddish. I could add some ultramarine in there. That's pretty good for that section. It has to go even darker. So I'll mix up more. I'll just put, oops, I think that was phthalo blue. That's okay, I can work with that. I'll put a little bit of quinacridone magenta in there. It does get pretty dark towards the bottom of that grape. So for the top of the grape, I would just add a little bit more white and just a touch of the yellow. It gives it like a highlight color on top. That might be a little bit too much. I could just add some of the regular green into it and come back in and put that in there. I'll just quickly put in some of this bowl color. One thing to keep in mind if you mix colors from a computer screen is the white of the screen is much brighter than what you get on a canvas. So you do have to make adjustments. So this is the highlight side of the bowl, and you can see how much lighter it is than the canvas. And that's how it is on the print too. And as I move towards the right side, I'll add in some of that other color that I mixed up. So just take a look at these two colors. You have this grayish color, and then this color here looks like the color of the pear. Well, just think about this. This color and that color are part of the same bowl. It's kind of weird to think of it that way, but when I compare it to the print, that is pretty much the color. So I'll put that in there now, and then I can work my way over and sort of transition those two colors together. It's mostly this section right here that's reflecting the pear color. This is a color I mixed up for the shadow area of the pear, but I can also use it for darkening the color of the bowl. So just dip into a little bit of that, and I can paint this section in here, which is pretty dark. So then I can blend these two together to create like the transition between these two colors. Still looks kind of weird, and like you don't think this is the color of the bowl, but I think once I get all these colors in here, it'll make sense. I'm softening this edge a little bit and making it a little bit darker because there is a little bit of a shadow at the bottom here. And I'll just dip into the gray color so that I can start blending these two sections together. I have most of those colors in here, and I'll use this softer watercolor brush to smooth them out a little bit. And I wipe some of the color off when I get into the darker sections. Just trying to smooth out this section that's a little bit more orange. There's a lot of subtle color in here, and it changes rather rapidly. Like one section transitions into another rather quickly. I think this needs to be more of a gradual transition here in the center. So I'm just trying to pull some of that in there. I might just leave that the way it is for now, and then I can come back and rework it a little bit. Here's some of that dark grape color, and I'll start working on those next. So the darkest sections are what I'll work on first. That might need to go even darker, so I could take some of this ultramarine quinacridone magenta, and I'll use the transparent yellow. A little bit more of the blue. And I'll see how dark that is. That does look darker. I think the darkest section's about right here. I have most of the dark sections put in. Now I'm putting in the lighter color. Towards the highlight, it gets lighter and more red. I'll put in a little bit of white and some pyrrole red. And in the center, I'll have to put in like an even lighter highlight. I might wait for it to dry a little bit before I do that. I'm going to take the time and fill in some of these parts of the bowl that I missed. There's like a shadow color in here. And then I'll move on to the pear and the countertop. This is the color of the lightest section of the pear, and I'll just put that in real quick. The colors start to make more sense when this pear color is in here because it reflects onto the bowl. Whereas if that's not in there, it just doesn't look right. This is the shadow section of the pear, and I'll start mixing that in there. That way I can blend it into the highlight color, and it creates a transition to the dark shadow. And the skin of the pear is kind of blotchy, so I don't really have to get this totally smooth. And whenever I need to, I'll just pick up some of that color and add it in there. And there's a section where the pear should be darker than the background, so that's another reason why I might paint the background a second time. Here's that shadow color as it is, without any of the warmer color. I do think it has to go a little bit darker. I'm going to take a walk, so I'll just mist my paint, put the lid on there, and that should keep it wet while I'm gone. The countertop is probably the most tedious part of this painting. So I'll just get started with this. I'll put in the basic colors, and after that I'll have to put in the textures. The part that's tedious is the reflection gets lighter right here, and that's what makes the countertop look glossy. This is the color I have, and then it has to go lighter, and it looks like it has to go more blue. I'll add more white to it and more ultramarine. I'll have to test it out on some paper just to make sure it's the right color. It still has to go lighter. It's a little bit better. I think it needs more ultramarine and a little bit of magenta. I think that's about right. So I'll just start with that. This color looks quite a bit different than the part that's not reflected. I can start working in some of the color of the veins that are in this countertop. What makes it look like it's glossy is when that color carries through the darker area here where it's not a reflection. So I'll see if I could put some of that in there. So I made that color a little bit darker so that stripe will continue through. It doesn't have to be accurate to the photo, but it does have to make sense. So I'm going to continue to work on this and develop it. The reflection gets a little bit lighter the closer it gets to the bowl. So this is this same color but with white added to it. What's interesting is this color here is about the same as it is over here. So this reflection color fades out by the time it gets to this point. I've got some of the basic colors in here. I'm just gonna come in here and soften it up a little bit. And when I'm done with that, I could probably paint some more lines on top of it. I made this part of the pear darker, and I'm just blending it into the lighter section. Now that I have the shadow of the pear darker, I'll go ahead and finish up the countertop. I'll start by blocking in the front edge and the right side. There's less detail on the right because of the shadows, so that should be easier. Sometimes it's helpful to move on to another part of the painting. That allows the paint to tack up so it's easier to paint on top of, but it's also good not to work on one section for too long, because you'll get burned out on it. I'm refining certain areas and putting the finishing touches on here. I spent some time putting in the textures of the countertop. I'll probably come back to that, add a little bit more detail. I'm currently working on the bowl. I painted in patches of color and then I'll blend them together. I still have some of the leftover background color, so putting a second coat on the background doesn't take too long. I only adjusted the color a little bit. Painting the background allows me to refine the shapes of the fruit in the bowl. Plus it eliminates any streaks or spots that I missed the first time around. I adjusted the colors of the pear a little bit. I felt like the highlight on the left should be a little bit lighter. The skin also has like a mottled texture to it, so I used a soft brush to glaze in some subtle textures. I put in the final details on the countertop and smooth out some of the highlights on the grapes. Here's the finished painting. Up next you can watch my video about why I don't use black paint, how to blend student acrylics like oils, or how to paint the illusion of transparent glass. Thanks for watching.